Hi, I'm Nadia, and welcome to my channel, where I'm exploring some of the hidden history of World War II. Today, I'm going to be looking at Joseph Stalin, who was arguably the most powerful political leader during the war. We knew him in the West as friendly Uncle Joe, who helped us to defeat Hitler and liberated many countries from brutal Nazi oppression. So he was a good guy, right? He was on our side. Well, there was a far more sinister side to this man that was kept hidden from view from people during that time and for many decades afterwards. So let's dive in and see what he was really like. Joseph Stalin became leader of the Soviet Union in 1924. It was the biggest country in the world, spanning the whole of North Asia. This landmass was really vast, more than twice the size of the United States. Most of the population lived in this southwestern area here, and the majority of the territory in the east and the north was relatively uninhabited and inaccessible, and it was a very harsh climate in much of those regions. Stalin had a vision of a communist utopia, a society in which everyone's needs would be provided by the state, a so-called workers' paradise. And you can see what a lovely person he must have been, smiling down paternally on these children who couldn't be happier to see him. These images of Stalin couldn't have been further from the truth of who he really was. So let's take a closer look. When Stalin came to power, the Soviet Union was a backward country whose economy was still dependent on agriculture. And out of a total population of 150 million, 120 million were peasants. So these were predominantly unskilled labourers. Stalin could see that there had been very rapid industrialization in Europe and America, and he believed that was an existential threat to the Soviet Union because it was being left so far behind these other rapidly developing economies. In 1921, there had been a devastating famine that killed 5 million people. And this famine exposed the fragility of an economy that was dependent on agriculture, which made it subject to natural disasters like crop failures. Because so many people died, the famine also left 7 million destitute orphans who were living on the streets with no one to take care of them. In one of the biggest humanitarian aid operations ever, America sent over 750 million tons of food to Russia that year. So what Stalin inherited was an economy that was in dire straits and a country that had been dependent on foreign aid. Stalin's solution to this situation was to industrialize the Soviet Union at breakneck speed. He implemented a massive program of construction of railways, canals, hydroelectric plants, and thousands of factories. And these were introduced over 5-year plans which had aggressive production targets. If we look at the gross domestic product when Stalin first came to office here, you can see that it was at an all-time low. But within just 10 years of him being in office, he managed to completely reverse this decline, which looks very impressive. But how exactly did he manage to pull that off? Stalin's 5-year programs brought about massive reforms, with a huge increase in the number of factories and manufacturing, especially in the production of goods like cars. And importantly, having these factories available meant that he was able to build tanks and munitions a few years later when the war started. Now, in addition to the construction of these factories and power plants and whatnot, he also had to expand the cities because there was a migration of about 30% of the peasant labour force into the cities in order to take up these manufacturing and service jobs. Hand in hand with Stalin's industrial reforms came an overhaul of agriculture. And this hammer and sickle emblem that was depicted on the communist flag represented the union of agricultural and industrial workers. But in practice, it wasn't really a union of agriculture and industry as was depicted in this poster, but rather it was a transition from a backward agrarian economy to a modern industrial economy. And that was done at the expense of the peasants. Peasants were told that surrendering their land to form larger state-owned collective farms would make them more efficient because they would then be able to be worked with tractors. But in actual fact, that was a lie, because less than half the collective farms even possessed a tractor, and they still relied on manual labour. They just had more land that had to be worked manually. Stalin's industrial reforms were expensive, and in order to pay for them, he had to export grain because that was his country's main product. He imposed draconian production quotas on the peasants. So now, not only was their land expropriated, they also had to surrender everything they produced to the authorities, leaving them without enough food to even feed their own families. As you can imagine, forced collectivization of farms was a very unpopular policy. There were thousands of riots involving millions of peasants who were rapidly becoming a thorn in Stalin's side. Of course, the peasants who owned the most land were the strongest objectors to collectivization, and Stalin singled them out, calling them kulaks, which was a derogatory term that marked them as enemies of the state. In 1930, Stalin introduced a new policy to eliminate kulaks as a class, so this was actually a form of genocide. But it became the means with which he enforced collectivization on the peasant population. Nearly 2 million kulaks were deported to forced labour camps. And this had two effects. First, it removed the opponents to collectivization, and it also served as a dire warning to other peasants that they needed to get with his program or they'd suffer the same fate. And this caused so much fear among the peasants that in some villages, the peasants themselves offered up the names of kulaks to the authorities in order to save their own skins. A direct result of Stalin's forced collectivization policy was a famine that killed 8 million people. So this was much worse than the famine in 1921. In the left two photographs, you can see peasants who had walked into the nearby towns where food restrictions were less severe, and they went there begging for food. But Stalin made it a criminal offence to feed these begging peasants, and that's why you can see people literally just walking past these poor people as they were dying in the street. The parts of the Soviet Union that were the most agricultural were, of course, the lands that were the most severely affected by this famine. And in Ukraine, there were 4 million deaths, and in Kazakhstan, another 1.5 million. Children were the most numerous casualties, and one of the most distressing aspects to me, because this famine lasted for 3 years, from 1930 to 33, was that people were so desperate that there were reports of cannibalism, and some parents resorted to eating their own dead children's bodies in order to stay alive. This famine was entirely preventable. It was man-made. It was made by Stalin. And it just shows Stalin's complete lack of compassion for these peasants. Now, this time, America was unaware that there was a famine happening in the Soviet Union, and there was no international aid given, even though the scale was much worse than it had been before. And I imagine that Stalin would have gone to great lengths to suppress any reports of what was going on in the Soviet Union, because this was happening just at the time as he was increasing his grain exports. So how would he be able to explain the fact that his own people were starving? I think this event alone tells you everything you need to know about Stalin's cruelty and his lack of humanity. And that's a subject I'll return to again in other videos. So let's go back to the nearly 2 million kulaks who were rounded up to be sent to penal camps. Now, where they were sent was to a network of hard labour camps known as the Gulag, which had already been established before Stalin's time, with about 84 camps to house criminals. But during Stalin's rule, this Gulag network expanded to 30,000 prison camps, which you can see depicted on this map. Now, Stalin saw the Gulag as a really excellent way to boost his industrialization targets and get access to valuable natural resources such as coal and timber, which was some of the raw goods that he needed to be able to complete his manufacturing goals. In fact, two of his showcase projects, the Moscow-Volga Canal and the Trans-Siberian Railway, were built entirely, or at least partly, with the labour of his Gulag prisoners. So the advantages of using the Gulag prisoners to Stalin were, well, he didn't really need to pay them at all. They were his slaves. And he didn't need to pay to accommodate them either, because they were just transported to these remote locations and left there and had to build their own barracks to live in. He also didn't need to provide expensive equipment to ease their workload. They were just given very primitive tools like hammers and picks, and they had to do this hard labour manually. He also didn't particularly worry about feeding these people. They were given starvation rations of a couple of slices of bread and some soup a day. But given the extreme climates they were living in and the long hours of hard manual labour, it was simply impossible for these prisoners to be able to survive more than a couple of years under those conditions. So here's our 2 million kulaks taken to Siberia, where they disappear. After this, Stalin became increasingly paranoid about people plotting against him. And during his so-called reign of terror, his political opponents were arrested and put on show trials. And then they were either shot or deported to the Gulag, never to be seen again. And I'll take a closer look at life inside the Gulag in another video. And they were followed by a purge of military leaders who Stalin also thought were plotting against him. He had his general shot and other soldiers were sent to the Gulag, which obviously didn't leave his army in the best shape when the war began a few years later. And that's how Stalin succeeded in creating the world's biggest prison. A staggering 18 million people are believed to have passed through the Gulag. 4 of my own relatives were among that number. Now, you may well be thinking that we're talking about events that have happened more than 100 years ago, and surely they can't have any bearing on the world we live in today. and I only wish that was true. But actually, Stalin left a legacy that was a blueprint for political oppression that is still being practiced across the world today. In fact, there are 57 countries that operate dictatorships, and that number seems to be increasing every year. Two examples are President Putin's Russia and President Xi's China. So I think that this history lesson should serve as a wake-up call to all of us who are lucky enough to live in democracies, and to really reflect on how fortunate we are to have the freedoms we have and how hard we need to fight to keep them. If you learned something new by listening to my video, or if you just enjoyed watching this, please give me a like below and check out my other videos. Thank you.